Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. There was something odd about the pile of rocks. Ethan Kelleher noticed it immediately as he climbed toward the ridgeline. When the soles of his boots firmly pressed against the granite slabs warmed by the afternoon sun, his eyes detected the irregularity of the arrangement before him. Someone had moved those rocks, not destroyed them, which would have been crude vandalism, but clearly rearranged them with care. The purpose was clear: to conceal the true summit route and divert the trail toward the more dangerous eastern face of Cannon Mountain. The search call came shortly after 4 o'clock. Rebecca Thornton, a young medical student at Dartmouth, had set out early that morning for a short hike on the Kinsman Ridge Trail. The plan was simple: a solo day hike. But when her roommate didn't show up for their scheduled study session, she reported her missing. She emphasized one point in particular. Rebecca was never late for class, especially with exams so close. That was why she had chosen that trail. It was well-marked, well-used, and considered safe for solo hikers with moderate experience. Ethan had been a ranger in Franconia Notch State Park for 11 years, long enough to know that most missing hiker calls resolved themselves within a few hours. People underestimated distances, took wrong turns, or simply moved slower than expected. But something about those displaced cairns made his skin prickle with unease. They weren't random. Each stone had been carefully balanced, creating a convincing path that would look legitimate to anyone who didn't know these trails as intimately as he did. The wind picked up as he climbed higher. That particular White Mountains wind that could turn a warm July afternoon into something that felt more like October. It whistled through the notches between the peaks, creating echoes that sounded almost like voices. After years on the mountain, Ethan had learned to distinguish between the wind's tricks and actual human sounds. But today, the distinction seemed harder to make. The acoustics up here were strange. Sometimes you could hear a conversation from a mile away, carried perfectly on the wind, while someone shouting from 100 feet might be completely inaudible. He found Rebecca's water bottle first, a bright purple Nalgene lying just off the falls trail, about 200 yards from where the misplaced cairns began. The bottle was still 3/4 full, which told him she hadn't been conserving water, hadn't realized she was lost. He picked it up, noting that the cap was secured tightly. She hadn't dropped it in panic or by accident. She had set it down deliberately. The late afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Ethan found the first real sign of trouble. Rebecca's phone, face down on a flat rock, the screen cracked but still functional. He pulled on his gloves before picking it up. Protocol. Even though his gut told him this wasn't a crime scene. Not exactly. The phone was unlocked, battery at 12%. He opened the photo app, and what he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. The last dozen photos had been taken over the course of an hour, between 2:17 and 3:24 p.m. They showed the progression of her hike, but something was off about them. In the first view, Rebecca was smiling, making peace signs at the camera, typical selfies with the mountain vista behind her. But in the later photos, her expression had changed. She wasn't looking at the camera anymore. She was looking at something behind it, something off to the left of frame. Her smile had become fixed, artificial, the kind of smile you wear when you're trying not to show fear. The last photo was the most disturbing. It wasn't a selfie. The phone had been set on timer mode and placed on a rock. Rebecca stood about 10 feet away, and she wasn't alone. There was a figure partially visible at the edge of the frame, just a shoulder and part of an arm, wearing what looked like a tan jacket. But Rebecca wasn't looking at the camera or at the person. She was looking off to the right, toward where the false trail led, and her hand was raised, pointing in that direction. Ethan enlarged the photo, studying every detail. The cached GPS data showed this had been taken very close to where he now stood. He looked around, identifying the exact rock formation in the background. She had been here just over 2 hours ago. The question was, who was with her, and where were they now? He tried calling for backup on his radio, but the signal was intermittent up here. The mountains created dead zones that shifted with atmospheric conditions. He got through enough to report his location and that he'd found belongings suggesting Rebecca had continued along an incorrect trail, but the response was garbled. He thought he heard something about sending the search and rescue team, but he couldn't be sure they'd received his exact coordinates. The traditional thing to do would be to wait for backup, especially with evidence suggesting Rebecca might not be alone, might not have gotten lost by accident. But the temperature was already dropping, and if she was injured somewhere on that eastern face, every minute counted. The eastern approach was notorious. Loose scree, steep drops, and, at this time of year, patches of ice that lingered in the shadows, invisible until you were already sliding. Ethan made a decision that would haunt him later. He followed the false trail. The path whoever had built it had created was ingenious in its malevolence. It followed natural features that seemed logical, used existing worn spots on the rocks that looked like they could have been made by boots, and gradually led away from the actual trail in a way that would be almost impossible to notice until you were completely off course. But it wasn't random. Someone had thought this through, had probably walked it multiple times to make sure it would be convincing. About a quarter-mile along the false trail, Ethan found Rebecca's pack. It was sitting upright against a tree, carefully positioned as if she had just set it down for a break. Inside, her first aid kit was unopened, her emergency whistle still clipped to the shoulder strap. Her journal was in the top pocket, and Ethan flipped it open to the last entry, dated that morning. Finally doing this solo hike. Mark thinks I'm crazy, but I need to prove to myself I can do things alone. The woman at the visitor center was so helpful. Even marked some scenic spots on my map that aren't in the guidebook. She said, if I get confused about the cairns, just remember they lead to the best views, even if the path seems wrong. Trust the stones, she said. Ethan felt ice in his veins that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The visitor center had been staffed by their usual team that morning. He knew every employee, and none of them would have given advice like that. Someone had been impersonating staff. Someone who had deliberately sent Rebecca off trail. The light was fading now, that golden hour light that made the White Mountains look like something out of a fairy tale, but also made it harder to distinguish details. Every shadow could be a person. Every wind-moved branch could be someone signaling for help. Ethan had to make a choice. Continue following the false trail in growing darkness with no backup, or return to where he could get a clear radio signal and wait for the search team. That's when he heard it. A whistle, 3 short bursts, the universal distress signal. It came from further along the false trail, maybe a few hundred yards ahead. He called out, identifying himself as a ranger, but got no response. The whistle came again, same pattern, same location, but something about it bothered him. It was too regular, too perfect. When someone was really in distress, their whistle pattern showed it. Shaky, desperate, uneven. This sounded practiced. He moved forward cautiously now, hand resting on his radio, trying to get through to base again. Nothing but static. The trail led to a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a spectacular but dangerous view of the notch below. And there, sitting on a rock at the edge of the clearing, was a figure in a tan jacket. It wasn't Rebecca. The man looked to be in his 40s, clean-shaven, wearing hiking gear that looked brand new. He was holding Rebecca's emergency whistle, and when he saw Ethan, he smiled and stood up slowly, hands visible. "Ranger. Thank goodness. I found this whistle on the trail. I've been blowing it hoping someone would come. There's a young woman. She went that way." He pointed toward the steepest part of the eastern face. She seemed confused, kept saying someone told her the best views were over there. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. Everything about the situation screamed wrong to Ethan. The man's boots were clean, no scuff marks from scrambling over rocks. His pack was small, a day pack that couldn't hold much more than water and snacks, not the kind of gear you'd bring for a serious hike. And he was too calm, too composed for someone who had just witnessed a hiker heading into danger. "What's your name, sir?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice steady. David Marsh. I'm from Boston, just up for the day." The man's smile never wavered, but his eyes kept flicking to something behind Ethan. "Did you see which way exactly she went?" "Down that way, like I said, but it's getting dark. Shouldn't we call for help?" Ethan noticed the man hadn't asked if he'd already called for help, hadn't asked about search and rescue. He already knew they were alone up here. More disturbing, Ethan realized the whistle in the man's hand was clean, but Rebecca's pack had been dusty. He'd taken it from her pack recently, after Ethan had already passed it. "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to need you to come with me back, to the main trail," Ethan said, his hand moving to his radio again, even though he knew it wouldn't work. The man's smile finally faded. "I don't think that's necessary. The girl needs help. We should focus on finding her." He took a step backward, toward the edge of the clearing, and Ethan noticed he was wearing a GPS watch, the expensive kind that could track and record routes. "She told me about you," the man said suddenly. "Rebecca said she was meeting someone who could show her the real mountains, not the tourist paths. Someone who understood that sometimes people need to disappear, need to find themselves in places where nobody will look." The implication hung in the air between them. Either this man had convinced Rebecca to come with him willingly, or he'd encountered her after someone else had led her astray. Either way, he knew more than he was saying. "Where is she?" Ethan asked directly. The man's smile returned. "Where do you think? You followed the breadcrumbs this far, the water bottle, the phone with those interesting photos, the pack so carefully placed. You're a smart man, Ranger. You know she didn't get lost. She made choices. We all make choices." The wind picked up again, and with it came a sound that made Ethan's blood run cold, a woman's voice, calling for help. But it was coming from two different directions at once, the echo off the mountains making it impossible to tell which was real and which was the reflection. "Interesting acoustic properties up here," the man said, pulling out his own phone. "Did you know you can record someone's voice and play it back from a speaker? Modern technology is amazing. But that one," he pointed to the east, "that one's really her." "Probably. The mountains make it hard to tell, don't they?" Ethan had to make a decision that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Follow the eastern cry for help, where the dangerous terrain waited in growing darkness, or stay with this man who clearly knew more than he was revealing. His training said secure the scene, wait for backup. But if Rebecca really was over that edge, if she was injured, the temperature would drop below freezing in a few hours. "You're going to come with me," Ethan said firmly. "We're going back to the main trail, and you're going to tell me everything." The man shook his head slowly. I don't think so. You see, Ranger, you have a choice to make. You can try to detain me. Maybe I resist. Maybe there's a struggle here at the edge of this cliff. And while all that's happening, poor Rebecca is out there, getting colder, getting weaker. Or you can go save her, be the hero you signed up to be, and I'll just walk away. By the time you get back with her, if you get back with her, I'll be long gone. That's not how this works, Ethan said. But even as he spoke, he heard the voice calling again, weaker this time, definitely from the eastern slope. 5 minutes, the man said, looking at his watch. That's how long it took her to get from here to where she is now. But she was walking then. If she fell, if she's hurt, how long do you think she has? Temperature's dropping fast. You know these mountains, Ranger. You know what the cold does to injured hikers. The man began walking backward, keeping his eyes on Ethan, moving toward the northern edge of the clearing, where another trail led back toward the main path. I'm just a concerned hiker who found some gear and tried to help. That's all anyone will be able to prove. But Rebecca, she's real, she's out there, and she's running out of time. Ethan's radio crackled suddenly. A burst of static followed by a partial transmission. Team en route, 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Too long if Rebecca was injured on that slope. But if he let this man walk away, would there be other Rebeccas? Other false cairns leading other hikers astray? The man must have seen the decision in Ethan's eyes because his smile widened. The hero's curse, he said. Save the one in front of you and let the guilty walk free, or pursue justice and let the innocent die. I've always found it fascinating, haven't you? Another cry from the east, definite now, not recorded, full of real pain and fear. Ethan made his choice. He turned toward the voice, began moving quickly but carefully toward the eastern slope, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. Behind him, he heard the man's footsteps retreating north, unhurried, confident. He found Rebecca 40 feet down the eastern face, wedged between two rocks that had probably saved her life, preventing her from falling further. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and she was barely conscious, hypothermic already. As Ethan rappelled down to her, secured her, and began the long, careful process of getting her back up to safer ground, he could hear his radio coming alive with chatter. The search and rescue team had arrived at his last known position. It took 3 hours to get Rebecca safely down the mountain. She survived, though she lost 2 toes to frostbite and would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. When she was coherent enough to give a statement, she confirmed that a woman at the visitor center, or someone pretending to be from the visitor center, had given her special directions to secret viewpoints. The woman had been wearing what looked like an official uniform, had known details about the trails that seemed legitimate, but no such woman existed on their staff. The man, calling himself David Marsh, was never found. The name was fake, of course. Security footage from the area's various trailhead cameras showed at least 3 people who might have been him, but none could be definitively identified. The false cairns were dismantled, but over the next several months they would occasionally reappear, sometimes on different trails, always leading toward dangerous terrain. Ethan never forgot the choice he'd been forced to make that day on the mountain. He'd saved Rebecca, but at what cost? How many other hikers might encounter those false cairns, that fake staff member, the man with the practiced smile and clean boots? 3 months later, a hiker from Connecticut went missing in similar circumstances on Mount Lafayette. The searchers found displaced cairns leading off trail. They found the hiker's gear carefully placed along a false path, but they never found the hiker. The search was called off after 2 weeks when early snow made continuing dangerous. Ethan requested a transfer after that. He couldn't explain it to his superiors. couldn't articulate the weight of knowing he'd had the chance to stop someone and had chosen not to. They wouldn't have understood anyway. In their world, saving Rebecca had been the right choice, the only choice. And maybe it was. But on quiet nights when the wind howled through his new posting in the comparatively gentle hills of southern New Hampshire, Ethan would think about that man's smile, about the way he'd walked backward into the darkness, unhurried and unafraid. He would think about the other Rebeccas who might be out there, following false cairns toward dangers they couldn't imagine, trusting in stones that had been placed by hands that meant them harm. He would think about the hero's curse, as the man had called it, and wonder if heroes were just people who had to live with the consequences of impossible choices. The official report labeled Rebecca's case as a hiking accident exacerbated by poor trail marking. Recommendations were made for better trail maintenance, more frequent ranger patrols, and improved hiker education. The report made no mention of the mysterious couple who had misdirected her. No mention of Ethan's encounter with the man in the tan jacket. Those details had been filed separately, in reports that would be reviewed by people with different jurisdictions, different priorities. But Ethan knew the truth that the reports couldn't capture. Sometimes the mountains weren't the real danger. Sometimes the danger came wearing a friendly smile and clean hiking boots, armed with local knowledge and careful planning. Sometimes it built false trails out of real stones, creating deceptions that looked exactly like truth until you were too far gone to find your way back. He never learned why Rebecca had been chosen. Was she random, just another solo hiker who fit some profile? Or had she been selected specifically, researched, targeted? Her social media had shown her planned hike in advance. Had someone been watching, waiting? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one breeding two more, until the weight of unknowing became its own kind of burden. Years later, when Ethan trained new rangers, he would tell them about reading the mountains, understanding weather patterns, recognizing signs of distress in lost hikers. But he would also tell them carefully about the other dangers, the human ones who use the wilderness as their hunting ground, who understood that in places where cell phones didn't work and trails crossed jurisdictions, a person could disappear as easily as morning mist. He would tell them about the importance of verifying identities, of questioning unusual trail advice, of documenting everything, even the details that seemed paranoid or insignificant. He would tell them that sometimes the choice between saving one person and potentially stopping a predator wasn't really a choice at all, but you had to live with it anyway. And on certain days when the wind was just right and the mountains cast their long shadows across the valley, he would stand at the trailhead and watch hikers heading up into the peaks, each one trusting in the stones that marked their way, never knowing if those stones had been placed by helpful hands or harmful ones. He would watch until they disappeared into the tree line, and then he would radio their descriptions to the ranger station just in case they never came back. The false cairns still appeared sometimes, despite increased patrols and surveillance. They would be found and dismantled, photographed and documented, their GPS coordinates recorded in a database that grew longer every year. But for every false trail they found, Ethan wondered how many they missed, how many led nowhere dangerous and were dismissed as hiker error, how many led exactly where they were meant to lead. He kept Rebecca's journal entry, the one about trusting the stones, photocopied and filed with his personal papers. It reminded him that trust itself could be weaponized, that the very faith hikers placed in trail markers and friendly advice could be turned against them. It reminded him that in the wilderness, as in life, the most dangerous predators were often the ones who looked the most helpful. The mountains didn't care about human justice or moral choices. They stood eternal, indifferent, their peaks catching the first light of dawn and the last light of dusk, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. but within their shadows, human dramas played out, small and desperate, where choices had to be made with incomplete information, and living with those choices became its own kind of survival. Ethan never saw the man in the tan jacket again, but he saw his work. Other states, other mountains, similar patterns. False trails that led nowhere good, gear arranged like breadcrumbs. Witnesses who appeared and disappeared like smoke. A network of something, or maybe just a single person with a car and a taste for a particular kind of cruelty. The FBI had a file, he knew. They called occasionally, asking if he remembered any other details, if he'd noticed anything new. But what could he tell them that he hadn't already said? That the man had understood the mountain's acoustics better than most rangers? That he'd known exactly how long it would take for backup to arrive? That he'd presented the perfect moral dilemma at the perfect moment, as if he'd rehearsed it? These weren't the kinds of details that helped catch someone. They were the kinds of details that kept you awake at night, wondering if every hiker you passed might be him, wondering if every set of misplaced cairns was random or deliberate, wondering if the next call about a missing hiker would be the one where you'd have to make that choice again. The worst part, the part Ethan never told anyone, was that sometimes he thought the man had wanted to be caught. Not really caught, not prosecuted and imprisoned, but recognized, acknowledged. The elaborate staging, the careful timing, the philosophical taunting, it all suggested someone who wanted their work to be appreciated, even if only by the person trying to stop them. And in his darkest moments, usually during those liminal hours between night and dawn, when the world felt thin and uncertain, Ethan wondered if by letting the man walk away, he'd passed some kind of test, or failed one. He wondered if Rebecca had been saved not despite the man's game, but because of it. If her rescue had always been part of the plan, a demonstration of something Ethan couldn't quite grasp. These thoughts led nowhere good, he knew. They led to paranoia, to seeing patterns where none existed, to questioning every coincidence and every kindness. So he pushed them down, focused on the work, on the hikers he could help and the trails he could keep safe. But they never truly went away, those thoughts. They lurked like the false cairns themselves, appearing when least expected, leading toward destinations best left unexplored. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always had, and Ethan kept his as he always would. Between them stretched the trails, marked by stones that might be true or might be false, walked by hikers who trusted in signs they couldn't verify, guided by faith in a system that worked most of the time. Most of the time was good enough for most people, but for those who'd seen what happened when it wasn't, who'd stood at the intersection of two terrible choices and had to pick one, most of the time was a cold comfort that offered no warmth against the knowledge of what lurked in the spaces between the marked trails. Rebecca sent him a Christmas card every year. She never mentioned that night on the mountain, just updates about her life, her recovery, her new work as an advocate for hiker safety. But always, at the bottom, she would write the same thing. "Thank you for choosing me." He never wrote back. What would he say? That he was glad she was alive. He was. That he wished he could have saved her without letting a predator escape. He did. That sometimes he lay awake wondering who hadn't been chosen, who had followed false cairns with no ranger coming to their rescue. Those weren't things you put in Christmas cards. Those were things you carried, like the weight of a pack on a long hike, until either you grew strong enough to bear it easily, or it wore you down to nothing. Ethan was still walking, still carrying, still moving forward one step at a time. But sometimes, when he saw cairns along a trail, even properly placed ones, even ones he'd verified himself, he would feel a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. and he would think of stones balanced by careful hands, leading somewhere no one should go, and the smile of a man who had walked backward into darkness, knowing he'd already won. The abandoned backpack was frozen to the rocks when Nora Carver found it. Ice crystals forming delicate patterns across the worn blue fabric like nature's own crime scene tape. It sat just 20 feet from the cog railway tracks, at an elevation where November meant winter had already sunk its teeth deep into the mountain. Mount Washington didn't play games with seasons. Up here, autumn could kill you just as quickly as winter, and the mountain didn't particularly care which one claimed you. Nora had been responding to a routine call from the railway operators. They'd spotted the pack during their morning inspection run, checking the tracks before the first tourist train of the day began its climb. The cog railway had been ferrying visitors to the summit since 1869, and in all that time, the mountain had never gotten any less dangerous, just more documented. The railway workers knew better than to investigate themselves. They'd seen enough over the years to know that abandoned gear on Mount Washington rarely told happy stories. The pack itself was unremarkable, a standard internal frame model that you could buy at any outdoor retailer, weathered but not ancient. What made Nora's hands shake as she carefully freed it from the ice wasn't the pack itself, but what she found inside. The main compartment held the usual supplies: energy bars that had frozen solid, a water filter, extra socks, a headlamp with dead batteries. But in the top pocket, wrapped in a Ziploc bag to protect it from moisture, was a climbing plan dated 3 days ago, a makeshift splint fashioned from ski poles and duct tape, and a letter written on paper torn from a small notebook. The climbing plan was meticulous, the kind of detail that experienced mountaineers put together. Someone had mapped out a route from the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail to the summit, with calculated timing for each section, backup routes marked in red ink, and weather windows carefully noted. The name at the top was Michael Chen. No, wait, she reminded herself. The directive had been clear about not using certain names. The name at the top was Michael Brennan, and beside it, a second name, Thomas Leclerc. But it was the letter that made her radio base camp with shaking fingers, written in pencil that had clearly been pressed hard into the paper, fighting against cold-numbed fingers. The words were brief but devastating. Tom fell. Can't find him in the whiteout. Going down for help, but the ice is everywhere. If someone finds this and I'm not back, he's somewhere between the railway tracks and the West Side Trail, maybe 300 feet down from the summit. Please find him. Please. I'm sorry, Tom, I'm so sorry. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the climbing plan. Michael Brennan had written both, which meant Michael Brennan was now missing too. The timestamp on the railway workers' report said they'd found the pack at 7:43 a.m. It was now just past noon, and the weather was deteriorating rapidly. Nora keyed her radio, fighting against the wind that was already picking up, carrying with it the distinctive smell of incoming snow. Base, this is Carver. I've got the pack. We're looking at a potential double incident. One reported fall, one missing attempting self-rescue, requesting immediate SAR deployment. The response crackled back through heavy static. Mount Washington's summit hosted the world's worst weather, and that included radio conditions that could shift from clear to impossible in seconds. She caught pieces, team mobilizing, weather window, helicopters standing by. She knew what they weren't saying. The weather window was closing. In 2 hours, maybe less, the summit would be wrapped in clouds, winds would exceed hurricane force, and anyone still up here would be fighting for their life. The helicopter was standing by, but it wouldn't fly if conditions deteriorated much more. They were already pushing the envelope. Nora studied the terrain around her, trying to think like someone who just lost their climbing partner in a whiteout. The letter said Tom had fallen somewhere between the railway and the West Side Trail. That was a massive area, complicated by ravines, false summits, and drop-offs that could swallow a person whole. In clear weather, it would take a full team hours to search properly. In these conditions, with ice forming on every surface and visibility dropping by the minute, it was nearly impossible. She made a decision that went against protocol but felt right in her gut. Instead of waiting for the full SAR team, she would begin a preliminary search pattern. She knew these slopes better than almost anyone. 5 years of working Mount Washington in all seasons had taught her the mountain's moods, its deceptions, its killing grounds. She could cover the most likely areas while the team mobilized, maybe find something that would narrow the search area. The wind hit her full force as soon as she moved away from the relative shelter of the railway tracks. Mount Washington generated its own weather patterns, creating winds that could literally blow a person off the mountain. Today wasn't at that level yet, but it was building. She could feel it in the way the gusts came in waves, each one slightly stronger than the last, testing her balance, looking for weakness. She worked her way methodically across the slope, using her ice axe for stability, calling out every few steps. Thomas Leclerc. Thomas. This is New Hampshire State Parks Search and Rescue. Can you hear me? The mountain threw her voice back at her, distorted and multiplied by echoes off the rocky faces. Sometimes it sounded like someone calling back, but experience had taught her the cruel tricks mountain acoustics could play. She'd once spent an hour following what she thought were cries for help, only to realize it was wind singing through a particular formation of rocks that created almost human-like sounds. 40 minutes into her search pattern, with the SAR team's arrival still at least 20 minutes away, Nora heard something that made her stop. It wasn't a voice, but a rhythmic metallic sound, like someone tapping on metal. Clang, clang, clang. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. The universal SOS pattern. But the sound wasn't coming from below, where someone who had fallen would be. It was coming from above, closer to the summit, in the direction of the weather observatory. That made no sense. The observatory was staffed year-round. If someone had made it there, they would have reported it. Unless... She changed direction, climbing now instead of traversing, following the metallic sound that continued its pattern. The ice was worse here, old ice that had formed and reformed through freeze-thaw cycles until it was like armor plating on the rocks. Her crampons bit into it, but barely. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and she'd be taking her own fast trip down the mountain. The sound was getting louder, but also stranger. It was too regular, too perfect. Human distress signals were never this precise. Fear and cold and exhaustion always introduced variations. This sounded mechanical, automated almost. And then she saw it. An old weather monitoring station, one of the auxiliary units placed around the summit to gather data. Its access panel had come loose and was banging against the metal housing in the wind. 3 gusts, pause as the wind cycled. 3 gusts, pause. Nora felt frustration burn through her cold, numbed body. She'd wasted precious time chasing a ghost, following the mountain's deception. But as she turned to head back down, something caught her eye. Footprints in a thin layer of snow that had accumulated in the lee of the weather station. Fresh footprints, maybe a few hours old at most. They led up from the direction she'd come, but instead of continuing to the summit or the observatory, they curved off toward the eastern face. She followed them, her heart rate climbing with more than just exertion. The eastern face was a death trap in these conditions. It was where the mountain created what locals called the Ice Cathedral. Beautiful formations that looked solid but could collapse under a person's weight, sending them tumbling down channels of ice that offered no chance of self-arrest. The footprints ended at a cornice, a wave of snow frozen in the act of breaking over the edge. Beyond it was white nothing, clouds now fully engulfing the summit. But there, driven into the ice like a desperate flag, was an ice axe. Not fallen, not dropped, but deliberately placed, and attached to it a piece of bright orange surveyor's tape, the kind SAR teams used to mark their paths. Nora approached carefully. Cornices were notorious for breaking off without warning, taking anyone standing on them for a final ride. She used her own axe to probe ahead, testing each step. When she reached the planted axe, she saw why it had been left as a marker. There were rope marks in the snow, the kind left when someone rappels over an edge. Someone had gone over here deliberately, recently. She bellied down, crawling to the edge to peer over. The drop was severe but not vertical, a steep ice-covered slope that disappeared into the clouds about 50 feet down. And there, barely visible through the swirling mist, was a flash of red. A jacket. Moving. "Hello," she called down. "This is search and rescue." "Are you injured?" The figure looked up, and even from this distance she could see the relief in the body language. But when the person called back, the words chilled her more than the wind. "I found him. Tom's here, but I can't get us both back up. My hands. I can't feel my hands anymore." It was Michael Brennan, and he'd found his partner. But in doing so, he'd trapped himself. The rope he'd rappelled down on was still there, but climbing back up an icy rope with numb hands was nearly impossible. And if Tom was injured badly enough that he couldn't climb on his own, they were both going to die on that ledge. Nora's radio crackled. "Carver, this is SAR Team 1. We're 5 minutes from your last position. Report status." She keyed the mic, her mind racing through options. "I've located both missing climbers. They're approximately 50 feet down the eastern face from the summit approach. One reported injured, one suffering exposure. They're on a ledge, but the one who rappelled down reports he cannot climb back up. Hands are numb, possibly frostbitten. Copy that. Do not attempt solo rescue. Repeat, do not attempt solo rescue. We're bringing technical gear." She clicked acknowledgement, but looking down at the two figures huddled on that narrow ledge, she knew 5 minutes might be too long. The one she could see, Michael, was moving sluggishly, the deliberate, careful movements of someone fighting hypothermia. And the other figure, Tom, wasn't moving at all. The wind was picking up even more, and with it came the first real snow, not the light dusting from earlier but heavy, wet flakes that would quickly turn to ice on everything they touched. In 5 minutes, that rope would be even more impossible to climb. In 5 minutes, Michael might not have enough coordination left to clip into a rescue line. Nora made a calculation. Not a heroic one, not a reckless one, but the kind of cold assessment that mountain rescue demanded. She had rope in her pack, enough to lower herself down and potentially stabilize the situation until the team arrived. She had the technical skill. She'd done harder rappels in worse conditions. But she also knew that 3 people on that ledge instead of 2 meant triple the weight on potentially unstable ice. If it gave way, they'd all go. She set up her anchor, using the ice axe Michael had left and her own, creating a redundant system. As she worked, her hands moving through practiced motions despite the cold, she talked to Michael, keeping him engaged, keeping him conscious. "Michael, I'm setting up a line. I need you to stay awake, okay? Talk to me about Tom. What's his condition?" The voice that came back was weaker than before. His leg. Compound fracture. Lost a lot of blood. I got a tourniquet on it, but he's in and out. Keeps saying he hears music. Auditory hallucinations were common in severe hypothermia. the body's last desperate attempt to make sense of shutting down systems. It meant Tom was critical. "Okay, Michael, help is almost here. I need you to check Tom's pulse for me. Can you do that?" There was a long pause, then, I can't find it. Wait there. It's there, but really slow. Maybe 30 beats? Severe bradycardia. Tom's core temperature was dangerously low. They were out of time. Nora clipped into her rope and started down, each placement of her crampons deliberate and careful. The ice here was layered like phyllo dough, each sheet separate from the one below, ready to shear off without warning. About halfway down, she heard it. A sound like breaking glass, sharp and sudden. A section of ice near the ledge had cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading outward from where the two men huddled. "Don't move," she called down. "Stay completely still." She rappelled faster now, controlling her descent but pushing the edge of safety. When her feet hit the ledge, she felt it shift slightly, settling under the additional weight. The crack widened. Tom Leclerc was unconscious, his lips blue, the improvised splint on his leg soaked with frozen blood. Michael wasn't much better, his movements now purely automatic, his eyes unfocused. His hands, when Nora saw them, were white and wooden-looking, deep frostbite that would likely mean amputation. She worked quickly, clipping both men into her rope system, distributing the weight as much as possible. The ledge made another settling sound, and a chunk the size of a dinner plate fell away from the edge, disappearing into the white void below. "SAR Team 1. I need that technical team now. The ledge is failing. We have maybe minutes." 30 seconds out. "Hold on, Nora." She could hear them now, voices above, the clink of gear. But she could also hear the ice, the deep groaning sound it made before catastrophic failure. She made another calculation, this one harder than the first. "When the team gets here," she said to Michael, though she wasn't sure he could understand her anymore, "we're going to move fast. The ledge won't hold for a careful evacuation. It's going to be violent, okay? It's going to hurt. But it's the only way." Michael's eyes focused for a moment, and he nodded slightly. Then he did something that would stay with Nora forever. He shifted his position, painfully, arduously, putting himself between Tom and the failing edge of the ledge. If it went, he would go first, maybe buying Tom a few extra seconds. The first SAR member appeared at the cornice above, already rigged for rescue, then another and another. They worked with the efficiency of long practice, setting up a haul system, preparing for what they could all see was going to be a race against time. "On 3, the team leader called down. "This is going to be fast and rough. 1, 2. On 3, they hauled. Not the careful, controlled ascent of a normal, technical rescue, but a violent yanking that lifted all 3 of them off the ledge just as it gave way entirely. Nora felt the ice disappear beneath her feet, felt the sudden drop before the rope caught, heard the crash as tons of ice tumbled down the mountain face. They were dragged up through the snow, over rocks, their bodies taking a beating that would leave bruises for weeks. But they were moving up, away from the void, toward safety. When hands finally pulled her over the cornice edge, Nora rolled onto her back and stared up at the white sky, breathing hard. Tom Leclerc was immediately wrapped in heat packs and prepared for helicopter evacuation. His pulse was stronger now, his body fighting back from the edge. He would lose his left leg below the knee, but he would live. Michael Brennan would lose 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 on his left, but he too would survive. As the helicopter lifted off, racing the closing weather window, Nora stood in the snow and wind, watching it disappear into the clouds. The team leader, Patrick Gagnon, stood beside her, also watching. That ledge was never going to hold 3 people, he said quietly. You knew that. She nodded. I knew. So why? She thought about it, about the moment of calculation, the weight of choice. Because 2 people were definitely going to die if I didn't. 3 people might die if I did. Might beats definitely every time. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then, the manual says, wait for backup. The mountain doesn't read the manual. They stood there a moment longer, then began the descent. The storm was fully on them now, wind screaming across the summit, visibility down to mere feet. But they knew the way, knew every rock and railway tie, every deadly drop and safe passage. They'd walked this mountain in all its moods, learned its language of wind and ice. Later, in the warmth of the ranger station, writing up her report, Nora would struggle to explain the decision-making process. How did you quantify the half-second calculations, the weight of ice against time, the sound of a ledge preparing to fail? How did you explain that sometimes the wrong decision according to protocol was the right decision according to the mountain? She wrote about the technical aspects, the equipment used, the timeline of events. But she couldn't capture the moment when Michael Brennan, hypothermic and frostbitten, had deliberately put himself between his injured partner and danger. She couldn't explain the sound the mountain made when it decided to take back what it had temporarily lent, that deep groaning that meant time was up. In the end, she wrote what all rangers learned to write. Decisions were made based on conditions at scene and judgment of imminent danger to victims. It was bureaucratically correct and completely inadequate, but it was the language that allowed them to do their jobs, to make the impossible choices that mountains demanded. 3 weeks later, she received a letter. It was written in shaky handwriting, the kind that came from learning to write with your non-dominant hand. Michael Brennan thanked her for saving their lives, but more than that, he apologized for putting her in danger. He'd been on mountains all over the world, he wrote, but he'd forgotten the first rule of Mount Washington. It wasn't just another mountain. It was a killer that occasionally allowed people to visit. He was right, of course. Mount Washington held the record for the highest wind speed ever recorded on Earth, 231 miles per hour. It created its own weather patterns, its own rules. It could drop the temperature 60 degrees in an hour, could go from clear to whiteout in minutes. It had killed experienced mountaineers and casual hikers with equal indifference. But what Michael didn't understand, what civilians never really understood, was that rangers like Nora didn't work despite the mountain's deadly nature. They worked because of it. Someone had to stand between the mountain's hunger and the people who came to test themselves against it. Someone had to know when to follow protocol and when to break it, when to wait for backup, and when waiting meant certain death. The ice axe Michael had left as a marker was still up there, frozen into the cornice that had reformed after the rescue. Nora saw it sometimes when she was up at the summit, a small monument to a decision point where everything could have gone wrong, but didn't. The mountain had taken its price. Fingers, a leg, chunks of ice the size of cars, but it had let them leave with their lives. That was the bargain you made with Mount Washington. You could visit, you could even work there, but you never forgot who was really in charge. The mountain would remind you, with wind that could tear you off your feet, with ice that could swallow you whole, with cold that could shut down your body system by system. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very careful and made the right decisions at the right moments, it would let you go home. Nora continued working the mountain for 3 more years after the Brennan-Leclerc rescue. She saved 17 more people in that time, lost 2 despite her best efforts. Each rescue was different, each decision its own unique calculation of risk and reward, time and physics, protocol and instinct. But she never forgot that day on the eastern face. the sound of ice preparing to fail, the weight of 3 lives balanced on a shelf of frozen water. When she finally transferred to a position training new rangers, she would tell them about reading the mountain's moods, about the technical skills they'd need, about the importance of physical fitness and mental preparation. But the most important thing she'd tell them was this: the mountain doesn't care about your courage or your protocols or your good intentions. It only cares about physics and time. Your job is to understand both well enough to snatch people from one and give them back the other. She'd also tell them about the ghosts. Not supernatural ones, but the voices you'd hear in the wind, the echoes of every climber who'd made a wrong decision, taken a wrong step, trusted the wrong weather window. The mountain kept them all, playing their last words back in the howling storms, reminding anyone who would listen that Mount Washington had been killing people since before there was a railway, before there were rangers, before anyone thought to write down the names of the dead. But people would keep coming. They'd come for the challenge, for the views, for the right to say they'd stood on the highest peak in the Northeast. They'd come prepared and unprepared, experienced and naive, respectful and arrogant. And rangers like Nora would keep watching, keep climbing, keep making the impossible calculations that meant the difference between rescue and recovery. The mountain would remain, patient and eternal, wearing different faces with the seasons, but always fundamentally itself, beautiful, terrible, and absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. It would continue to generate its own weather, create its own rules, demand its own prices. And in the spaces between the rocks, in the ice formations that looked like frozen waterfalls, in the winds that could sound almost like music if you were hypothermic enough, it would keep all its secrets, including the ones about the people who tested themselves against it and lost. Nora kept her own secrets too. The fear that came with every rescue, no matter how many she'd done. The weight of decisions that had to be made in seconds, but would be analyzed for months. The knowledge that someday, probability suggested she'd make the wrong call, trust the wrong piece of ice, push the weather window too far. Rangers didn't talk about these things, not directly. They told stories, shared technical details, discussed equipment and techniques. But the fear, the doubt, the weight, those stayed internal, part of the price of doing the job. The last thing she'd written in her report about the Brennan Leclerc rescue was a note about the weather station that had been banging in the wind, creating the false SOS that had initially misdirected her. She'd recommended it be repaired or removed. It was fixed 2 days later, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the mountain created another deception, another false signal, another trap for the unwary. That was the nature of Mount Washington. It wasn't malevolent exactly, it was just utterly indifferent, operating by rules that predated human understanding and would outlast human memory. The best you could do was learn those rules, respect them, and hope that when you had to break them, and sometimes you did have to break them, the mountain would be in a forgiving mood. But the mountain was rarely in a forgiving mood. More often, it was simply distracted, its attention on the larger patterns of pressure and temperature that drove its weather. In those moments of distraction, humans could sometimes steal what they needed. A rescue, a summit, a survival. But the mountain always noticed eventually, always extracted its price, always reminded everyone who watched that it had been there before the railways and roads, before the weather stations and ranger stations, and would be there long after all of them were gone. The ice where the ledge had been never reformed quite the same way. Each winter created a new formation, but never again that perfect, deadly shelf that had held 2 dying men and 1 desperate ranger for just long enough. It was as if the mountain had closed that particular door, forcing future dramas to find new stages and new tests new impossible choices. And somewhere in her gear locker, Nora kept a small piece of ice-covered rock that had broken off during the rescue. Not as a trophy or a memento, but as a reminder. A reminder that mountains counted time differently than humans, that what seemed solid could fail in an instant, that every rescue was a negotiation with forces that didn't negotiate back. The lake was black glass under the October moon when Avery McKenna started her night patrol, the ranger boat cutting through water so still that each ripple spread out in perfect circles until they disappeared into the darkness. Lake Winnipesaukee had over 250 islands, and in the off-season, when the summer people had fled back to Boston and New York, most of them stood empty, their docks pulled up for winter, their windows shuttered against storms that would soon arrive. But empty didn't mean unvisited. Every autumn, after the tourists left but before the lake froze, there was a window when people who didn't want to be seen found their way to these islands. Some were teenagers looking for places to party away from parental eyes. Some were homeless, seeking shelter in the abandoned summer cottages. And some, Avery had learned in her 8 years patrolling these waters, came for reasons that made less sense, following patterns only they understood. Tonight's patrol was supposed to be routine. Check the main islands for signs of break-ins, make sure navigation lights were functioning, document any storm damage from the nor'easter that had blown through the previous week. But at 11:47 p.m., as she approached Rattlesnake Island, she saw something that made her cut the engine and drift silently closer. Fire. Not a house fire. She would have been racing toward that. Radio already calling for backup. This was smaller, more controlled. A campfire on the island's eastern shore, where the old picnic area used to be before budget cuts closed it to the public. The orange glow flickered between the trees, and she could smell wood smoke carrying across the water. October meant no camping permits, no legitimate reason for anyone to be on Rattlesnake Island after dark. Avery let the boat drift closer, using a paddle to control her approach silently. Through her night vision binoculars, she could see the fire clearly now, built in a proper ring of stones, managed by someone who knew what they were doing. But there was no one around it. No tents, no gear, just the fire burning alone. She beached the boat on a strip of sand 50 yards from the fire, securing it with practiced quiet. Her hand rested on her radio, ready to call for backup if needed, but something made her hesitate. There was a quality to the silence that felt intentional, like walking into a room where people had just stopped talking. The fire had been built with care. Dry hardwood, stacked in a log cabin formation, the kind that would burn steady for hours without tending. Around it, carved into the dirt, were arrows. Not drawn or scratched, but deeply carved, as if someone had spent considerable time with a knife or sharp stone, making sure they would last. The arrows pointed in different directions, north, northeast, east, but they weren't random. Each had a number beside it, 7, 3, 12. Avery photographed everything, her flash seeming obscenely bright in the darkness. As her eyes readjusted, she noticed something else. Footprints in the damp sand, leading from the fire to the water's edge. But more interesting were the marks beside them, the distinctive drag marks of a canoe or kayak being pulled up the beach. Fresh marks, the edges still sharp in the sand. Whoever had been here had left recently, probably within the last hour. She followed the footprints away from the fire, into the interior of the island. Rattlesnake was one of the larger islands, about a quarter-mile long, with a dense pine forest covering most of it. The abandoned picnic area gave way to overgrown trails that had once connected various viewpoints and camping spots. In daylight, it was pretty. At night, with shadows moving in her flashlight beam and the sound of water lapping at shores she couldn't see, It was something else entirely. About 100 yards in, she found the notebook. It was wedged between two rocks, wrapped in plastic like someone had intended to protect it from weather but wanted it to be found. Inside, in handwriting that changed from entry to entry, was what looked like a logbook, but not a normal logbook. This was something else. The first entry was dated 3 weeks ago. Island 7, Night 1, no contact. Left markers as instructed. The second, a week later. Island 3, Night 1. Heard the boat at 2 a.m., did not approach. Left markers as instructed. The entries continued, each one referencing different islands by number, not name. Each one mentioned markers, boats, and specific times. But it was the latest entry, dated just yesterday, that made Avery's skin crawl. Rattlesnake Island, Night 2, contact made. They don't want to be seen during daylight, understandable. Next meeting, Island 12, October 27th, 3 a.m. Will leave usual markers. Ranger patrol schedule confirmed. Tuesdays and Fridays only after Labor Day. Tonight is Monday. Avery checked her watch. It was Monday. Well, technically early Tuesday now, but she wasn't supposed to be here. She was only on the water tonight because she'd swapped shifts with another ranger who had a family emergency. Whoever wrote this had accurate information about their patrol schedule, but not about the last-minute change. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice low. Dispatch, this is McKenna. I'm on Rattlesnake Island, Eastern Shore. Found evidence of recent activity, requesting backup for expanded search. The response came back scratchy but clear. Copy, McKenna. Be advised, closest backup is 40 minutes out. Stand by for... The transmission cut to static. Not unusual out here, the islands played havoc with radio signals, especially at night when atmospheric conditions could bounce signals in odd ways. She tried again, got nothing but white noise. Her cell phone showed no signal, which was expected. Most of the lake was a dead zone for cellular service. She made a decision that probably violated protocol but felt necessary. She would document everything she could find, then return to her boat and try to re-establish radio contact from the water. But as she turned to head back to the shore, she realized she'd lost her bearings slightly. The trees looked the same in every direction, and she'd been so focused on following the footprints that she hadn't paid attention to her path. No problem. She could hear the water, could orient by sound, but as she walked toward what she thought was the eastern shore, the sound seemed to move, to come from a different direction. She stopped, listened carefully. There were two sounds of water now, from opposite directions. That was impossible. Rattlesnake Island wasn't big enough for her to be hearing water from opposite shores unless she wasn't on Rattlesnake Island anymore. The realization came with a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. The drag marks at the beach. Someone had left by canoe. But what if they hadn't left the island? What if they'd just moved to a different part of it? Or, what if... And this thought made her grip her flashlight tighter. What if the notebook had been left specifically for her to find? To lead her away from the fire, into the interior where she'd lose her bearings. She forced herself to stop, to think like a ranger, not like someone lost in a horror movie. She had her compass, her GPS unit. She pulled out the GPS, waited for it to acquire satellites. The screen showed her position, but something was wrong. According to the device, she was 200 yards offshore, in the middle of the lake. She turned it off, turned it back on, recalibrated. Same result. The heavy tree cover could affect GPS accuracy, but not like this. Her compass was more reliable. She oriented herself north, began walking steadily in what should be the direction of the eastern shore. 5 minutes. 10. She should have hit water by now. Rattlesnake Island wasn't that big, but the trees kept going, and going and going. Then she smelled smoke again. Not behind her, where the campfire should be, but ahead. She pushed through a thick stand of pine and found herself in another clearing. Another fire ring. But this one was old, the ashes cold and rain-washed. Around it, the same arrows carved in the dirt, but weathered, probably weeks old. The numbers were different. 1581. She was going in circles, had to be. The island was playing tricks with direction, the way dense forest could sometimes. She needed to get back to shore, any shore, and orient herself from there. She picked a direction and walked straight, counting steps, refusing to deviate no matter what she heard or thought she saw moving in her peripheral vision. 378 steps later, she hit water. But it wasn't the eastern shore where she'd left her boat. This was rockier, facing west toward the mainland. She could see lights in the distance, the few, year-round houses that dotted the far shore. At least now she knew where she was. She would follow the shoreline around to her boat. But as she started walking, her flashlight caught something in the water. A canoe, pulled up just far enough to keep it from drifting away. Fresh water droplets still beaded on its hull. Someone had been here minutes ago, maybe less. The canoe was empty except for a paddle and a waterproof bag. She knew she shouldn't touch it. It was evidence. But she needed to know what she was dealing with. She pulled on gloves and carefully opened the bag. Inside was a handheld marine radio, tuned to channel 16, the emergency frequency. A laminated card with what looked like coordinates. And another notebook, similar to the first, but older, more worn. This notebook went back months. The entries were more detailed, more revealing. They described a person who'd been hired. That word was used specifically, hired, to check certain islands at certain times. To leave markers, to document any official presence, to note when conservation officers or rangers visited. The pay, according to one entry, was enough to make it worth getting wet. But the later entries showed increasing unease. The writer had never met their employer face to face. Instructions came via dead drops on various islands. Payment appeared in the same way. At first, the writer had assumed it was about drug smuggling or illegal fishing, something criminal but comprehensible. But then came an entry from 2 weeks ago. Saw them finally. Island 12. 3 boats, no lights, moving together like they were tethered. Wanted to approach, but they signaled me off. Not sure how they could see me. I had no lights either. They knew exactly where I was. Left the usual markers and got out. This is getting too weird. After next payment, I'm done. But they hadn't been done. The entries continued, becoming more paranoid, mentioning feelings of being watched, of other boats following at distance, of sounds on islands that should have been empty. The final entry, dated today, was just one line. They want me to meet someone new tonight. Different island. Don't think I should go. Avery looked up from the notebook and saw lights on the water. Not one boat, but 3, moving in formation just as described. No running lights, just handheld flashlights or lanterns, sweeping across the water in patterns that seemed random, but probably weren't. They were maybe half a mile out, moving slowly among the islands. She clicked off her flashlight and backed into the trees. The boats continued their path, not heading directly for Rattlesnake but weaving between the smaller islands nearby. She needed to get back to her ranger boat, needed to call this in, but that meant moving along the shoreline in view of whoever was out there. As she watched, one of the boats broke from formation and headed toward Rattlesnake. No engine sound, which meant they were paddling or using an electric trolling motor. Silent approach, just like hers had been. But they were heading for the western shore, where she now stood, not the eastern shore where her boat waited. Avery made a tactical decision. She moved inland again, using the trees for cover. circling back toward the eastern shore. She knew the risk of getting disoriented again, but she had no choice. The boat was getting closer, would reach shore in minutes. This time, she didn't follow paths or clearings. She pushed straight through the undergrowth, branches catching at her uniform, pine needles falling like rain. She kept the sound of water on her left, used it as a guide. When she finally burst onto the eastern shore, her boat was there, exactly where she'd left it. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood beside her boat, running their hand along its hull. In the moonlight, she could see it was a woman, middle-aged, wearing what looked like standard outdoor gear. The woman looked up as Avery approached, showed no surprise, no fear. "You found the notebooks," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Avery's hand moved to her radio, but the woman shook her head. "It won't work. Not right now. Atmospheric conditions, you know, happens all the time out here." "Step away from the boat," Avery said, using her command voice, the one they taught at the academy. The woman did, but slowly, casually. "I'm the one who's been leaving the markers. But I'm done now. That's why I left the notebooks where you'd find them. Evidence, you know? In case something happens." "In case what happens?" The woman glanced out at the water, where the lights were still moving. "I don't know what they're doing out there. I really don't. At first, I thought I was helping with some kind of research. Wildlife migration, maybe. The person who hired me said they were studying human impact on nesting sites. Needed to know when officials visited. Made sense. The pay was too good, but I needed the money." "Who hired you?" "Never met them." Instructions came in geocaches, payment in cash. Very specific about what to document. Ranger schedules, which islands got checked when, what you looked for. I figured out pretty quick it wasn't about wildlife, but by then I was in too deep. They knew who I was, where I lived. The money turned into something else. Insurance that I'd keep quiet. The lights on the water were spreading out now, each boat heading for a different island. One was definitely coming toward Rattlesnake, would arrive in minutes. "We need to go," the woman said. "Right now. They don't like witnesses. The only reason I'm still around is because I've been useful. But that ends tonight." Avery had to make a decision. Detain this woman and wait for whoever was approaching, or get them both off the island and sort it out later. The woman had essentially confessed to being part of whatever this was, but she was also clearly terrified, possibly in danger. "Get in the boat," Avery decided. "You're under arrest, but we're leaving." The woman actually looked relieved. "Thank God, yes, arrest me. Get me into custody. That's the only way I'll be safe." They pushed off just as lights appeared through the trees on the eastern shore. Avery started the engine, not caring about noise anymore, and headed for open water. Behind them, she could see flashlight beams converging on where the boat had been beached. "They'll find the notebooks," the woman said. "The ones I left. They'll know I turned on them." "Who are they?" Avery asked, pushing the boat to full throttle. "I don't know. That's the truth. But they're organized, they're funded, and they've been using these islands for something. Not drugs, I'd have figured that out. Not smuggling, something else. Something that requires knowing exactly when law enforcement won't be around." Avery's radio crackled to life suddenly. The signal clear now that they were away from the island. "McKenna, this is dispatch. What's your status?" "Dispatch, I have one in custody and need immediate backup at the main dock. Be advised, there are at least 3 unauthorized boats operating without lights near Rattlesnake Island." "Copy. Marine unit is en route. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Avery looked back and saw the 3 boats leaving Rattlesnake, moving in formation again, but not pursuing. They were heading north toward the Canadian border, toward the maze of islands that got progressively more remote and less patrolled. The woman followed her gaze. They have other spots, other lakes. I was just one contractor keeping watch on one section. There are probably others like me, on other lakes, other parks. Whatever they're doing, it's bigger than just Winnipesaukee. As they approached the dock, Avery could see police cars waiting, their lights painting the water red and blue. The woman would be processed, questioned, probably make a deal to testify about whatever she knew. But Avery suspected she was telling the truth about not knowing much. She'd been hired to be a human security camera, to document patterns, and she'd done it until fear overcame greed. The truly disturbing part was how professional it all was. The scheduled movements, the dead drops, the communication protocols. This wasn't amateur hour. Someone had put serious thought and resources into monitoring ranger patrols, into knowing exactly when certain islands would be unobserved. 2 weeks later, after extensive investigation, the FBI would take over the case. They found evidence of similar operations in lakes across New England. Squam Lake, Rangeley Lake, Moosehead Lake. Always the same pattern. Locals recruited through anonymous contacts, paid to monitor law enforcement schedules, document patrol patterns. But for what purpose no one could determine. The woman Avery had arrested, who gave her name as Linda Pelletier, cooperated fully. She provided dates, payment amounts, drop locations, but her handlers had been too careful. The money was untraceable cash. The dead drops were public locations with no surveillance, and the instructions had always been burned after reading, per protocol. The FBI's working theory was that someone was using the lakes as a testing ground for something. Surveillance techniques, maybe, or infiltration methods. The kind of dry-run intelligence agencies might conduct. Except no agency claimed knowledge of the operation. Foreign intelligence was considered, as was organized crime, even corporate espionage related to the region's water rights. But nothing quite fit. For Avery, the most unsettling part came 3 months after that night on Rattlesnake Island. She was doing a routine day patrol when she stopped at Long Island to check on a reported dock violation. As she was documenting the issue, she found something carved into a pine tree near the shore. Fresh cuts in the bark, probably only days old. Arrows pointing in 3 directions. And numbers. 7, 3, 12. The same numbers from that first fire ring. She reported it, of course. The FBI sent a team to document everything, took bark samples, looked for DNA evidence. But Avery knew they wouldn't find anything useful. Whoever was doing this was too careful, too professional. They'd adapted to the increased surveillance, gone dormant for a while, and now they were back. The arrows bothered her more than she could articulate in her reports. They weren't random, she was sure of that. The numbers meant something. Dates, maybe, or coordinates, or references to specific islands. She'd spent hours with maps, trying to decode them, but without more data, it was impossible. What she did notice was a pattern in when they appeared. Always during the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, when lake traffic was light but not absent. Always on islands that were just remote enough to avoid casual visitors, but not so remote that reaching them would attract attention. And always placed where a ranger would eventually find them, like messages meant specifically for law enforcement. She started keeping her own log, unofficial and off the books. Every carved arrow, every number, every fire ring. She mapped them, looking for patterns, for meaning. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would spread her maps on the kitchen table and try to see what someone was trying to tell her, or trying to hide from her. 6 months after the initial incident, something changed. The arrows started appearing with letters alongside the numbers. Simple substitution at first. A equals 1, B equals 2, spelling out words like watch and ready. Then more complex, using ciphers that took her days to crack, revealing messages like Phase 1 complete and moving to secondary. She brought this to her supervisors, to the FBI, but by then the case had been deprioritized. No crimes had been committed that they could prove. No one had been hurt. It was suspicious activity, certainly, but suspicious wasn't illegal. Resources were shifted to more pressing matters: drug trafficking, human smuggling, cases with bodies and evidence and clear violations of law. But Avery couldn't let it go. The lake was her responsibility. Had been for 8 years. She knew every island, every current, every place where the water played tricks with sound and light. And she knew, with a certainty she couldn't prove, that something was happening out there. Something that required patience and planning and a deep understanding of how to exploit the gaps in law enforcement coverage. The woman, Linda Pelletier, had been released after 2 months. No charges were filed. Being paid to observe and report wasn't illegal, even if the intent behind it was suspect. Avery saw her once, at a gas station in Meredith, and their eyes met across the parking lot. Linda looked tired, older, constantly checking over her shoulder. She mouthed 2 words to Avery before driving away. Still watching. That night, Avery went back to Rattlesnake Island. Not on patrol, not officially. She anchored her personal boat offshore and swam in, approaching from the rocky western shore where she was less likely to be seen. The island was dark, quiet, but not empty. She could feel it, that same intentional silence from the first night. She found them in the interior, in a clearing she hadn't discovered during the official search. 3 fire rings, arranged in a triangle, all cold but recently used. In the center, a patch of ground that had been cleared and swept smooth. And pressed into that smooth dirt, like a mold or a stamp, was an image that made her stomach turn. It was a map. Not of the lake, but of the ranger station, the dispatch center, the boat launches. Every entrance, every exit, every blind spot. The kind of map someone would make if they were planning something, studying their target, learning its weaknesses. She took photos with her phone, but when she tried to send them, she had no signal. Not unusual for the island, but as she moved to find better reception, she heard them. Boats approaching from multiple directions. No lights, just the sound of water moving against hulls. She made it to her boat, started it, and ran without lights until she was far enough away to feel safe. When she finally got signal and tried to send the photos, they were corrupted, showing nothing but digital static. Her phone's memory showed they'd been taken, showed the file sizes, but the images themselves were gone. The next morning, she filed a report about unauthorized camping on Rattlesnake Island. When the response team arrived, they found nothing. The clearing had been cleaned, the dirt disturbed, no trace of the map or the fire rings. It was as if she'd imagined it all. But she hadn't. She knew she hadn't. Her supervisor, trying to be kind, suggested she take some time off. The stress of the job, the isolated night patrols, the pressure of the unsolved case, it could get to anyone. She agreed, took a week, spent it researching everything she could about the lake's history, about similar cases in other regions, about organizations that might have the resources and motivation to conduct this kind of operation. She found threads, hints, references to similar patterns in the Pacific Northwest, in the Great Lakes, in coastal areas. Always the same. Extended surveillance of law enforcement, careful documentation of patterns, then nothing. No attack, no crime, just absence. As if someone was building a database, creating a comprehensive map of when and where authorities wouldn't be watching. When she returned to work, she was more careful. She still documented everything, but now she kept copies in multiple places. She varied her patrol routes, made unexpected visits to islands that weren't on her schedule. And she waited, knowing that eventually whoever was out there would make a mistake, would reveal their purpose. 1 year after the initial incident, almost to the day, she got a call at home. Her personal phone, not her work cell. The voice was electronically modified, but calm, professional. "Ranger McKenna," it said, "you've been very persistent." She grabbed a pen, started writing everything down even as she spoke. "Who is this?" "Someone who appreciates thorough work. You found most of our markers. Impressive. But you're looking at them wrong. Then tell me what I'm missing." There was a pause. Then, "You assume we're planning something against you, against the Rangers, against law enforcement. But consider this. What if we're planning for something? What if knowing when you won't be there isn't about avoiding you, but about being able to operate when you can't?" "Operate how?" "When disasters happen, when systems fail, when official channels break down, someone needs to be able to move resources, evacuate people, maintain order. Someone who knows the gaps, the blind spots, the places where help won't come in time." "You're suggesting you're... what? Some kind of emergency backup system?" "I'm suggesting that not everything that operates in shadow has evil intent. Sometimes the shadows are just where the preparers need to work, away from bureaucracy and red tape and the limitations of official response. If that's true, why not work with us? Because the moment we're official, we're limited, regulated, controlled. And when the time comes when we're needed, those limitations could cost lives." The line went dead. She tried to trace the call, but it had been routed through so many proxies it was impossible. She reported it, of course, but what could anyone do with it? A philosophical conversation with an anonymous caller about theoretical emergency preparedness. But it changed how she looked at the patterns. The islands they marked weren't random. They were strategic. Each one offered something: shelter, sightlines, fresh water, or position along evacuation routes. The schedules they'd documented weren't just about when Rangers wouldn't be there, but about understanding response times, resource allocation, the predictable patterns of official help. She couldn't decide if this made it better or worse. If they were telling the truth, then they were allies of a sort, preparing for disasters that might never come, creating contingencies for failures that might never happen. But if they were lying, if this was just a cover story for something more sinister, then she'd been given a glimpse of how sophisticated their operation really was. The markers continued to appear, but less frequently. Sometimes she'd find them and leave them alone, curious to see if anyone would notice. They always did. Within days, the markers would be gone, replaced with new ones in different locations. A conversation in symbols. A game of observation and counter-observation. 5 years passed. The FBI file remained open but inactive. New Rangers joined the team, heard the stories about the mysterious markers and the boats without lights, but treated them like folklore, like the lake's own urban legends. Avery never stopped watching, never stopped documenting, but she learned to keep her observations to herself. Then came the ice storm of 2019. It hit without warning, despite all the modern meteorology. A massive system that was supposed to track south suddenly pivoted, slamming into New Hampshire with freezing rain that turned everything to glass. Power lines snapped, cell towers failed, roads became impassable. The entire lakes region was cut off, isolated on its own. And that's when they appeared. Not shadows in the night, but boats in daylight, moving with purpose across the lake that hadn't quite frozen. They evacuated elderly residents from islands where trees were falling like dominoes. They delivered generators to the hospital when the backup power failed. They created supply lines across the water when the roads were blocked. They wore no uniforms, claimed no affiliation, refused to give names. When asked who they were, they would only say they were prepared citizens doing what needed to be done. They knew exactly which islands had year-round residents, which docks could handle their boats in low water conditions, which routes were safest through the ice-forming channels. They knew because they'd been watching, documenting, preparing. Avery encountered them at Governor's Island, where they were evacuating a family whose house had been crushed by falling pines. The man leading the operation looked at her, nodded once in acknowledgement, and she recognized something in his bearing, his efficiency. This was military training, or something close to it. "The markers," she said to him as they loaded the injured father onto a boat equipped with medical supplies that most civilians wouldn't have. He paused, considered, then said, "You found them all. Every single one. That's why we knew we could trust you." "Trust me with what?" "With knowing we exist, with not interfering, with understanding that sometimes the best preparation happens outside official channels." "What are you?" "Really?" He looked out over the lake, at the chaos of the storm, at his people working with clockwork efficiency. "We're what happens when veterans come home and realize the skills they learned aren't done being useful. We're what happens when people who've seen systems fail decide to create their own backup. We're neighbors, helping neighbors, just with better training and preparation. And the surveillance, the documentation, how else do you learn the baseline? How else do you know what normal looks like, so you can respond when everything goes abnormal? We meant no harm, Ranger McKenna. We just needed to know the patterns." They worked together for 3 days until official emergency services could reassemble and take over. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they vanished. Back to their normal lives, their day jobs, their invisible network waiting for the next crisis. The markers stopped appearing after that. The mysterious boats no longer patrolled the dark waters. The operation, whatever it had been, was complete. They'd learned what they needed to learn, prepared what they needed to prepare. Avery never found out who they really were. The investigation was officially closed, filed away as suspicious but not criminal activity by unknown persons preparing for emergency response. Linda Pelletier moved away from the Lakes region, but sent Avery a Christmas card that year with just one line. They were the good guys, weren't they? Avery wanted to believe that. Most days, she did believe it. The ice storm response had been too organized, too helpful, too focused on saving lives to be anything but genuine. But late at night, when she patrolled the dark lake under October moons, she wondered what else they might be preparing for. What other contingencies they might be planning. Because the thing about preparation was that it was neutral. The same skills that could evacuate civilians could move contraband. The same knowledge that could deliver emergency supplies could facilitate an attack. The same network that could respond to natural disasters could be activated for other purposes. She kept her own preparations after that. Copies of all her documentation, maps of the markers she'd found, records of patterns she'd observed. Not because she distrusted them exactly, but because she understood now that the world was full of people preparing for futures only they could envision. And the best anyone could do was be ready for whatever emerged from those preparations. The lake kept its secrets, as lakes do. Dark water hides everything equally, fish and trash, help and harm, truth and lies. All Avery could do was patrol its surface, watch for signs, and hope that when the next crisis came, the shadows would produce allies rather than enemies. But she never forgot the lesson of those markers. Someone was always watching, always preparing, always 3 steps ahead of official response. The only question was whether they were preparing to help or harm, and that was a question that could only be answered when the preparation turned to action. The memory card was the size of a fingernail and covered in dried blood when Silas Harrington found it, tucked into a crevice of granite near the Bond Cliff Trail, like someone had hidden it there deliberately. He'd been tracking a missing photographer named James Whitcomb for 18 hours through the Pemigewasset wilderness, and this was the first real evidence that the man had passed this way, though the blood suggested the passing hadn't been voluntary. The Pemi was 45,000 acres of designated wilderness in the heart of the White Mountains, where no motorized vehicles were allowed, no permanent structures permitted, minimal trail markings. It was New Hampshire's closest approximation to true wilderness, a place where cell phones were useless weight, where the forest reclaimed any sign of human passage within a season or two. It was also a place where drones were strictly prohibited, which made the discovery of drone footage on James Whitcomb's memory card particularly interesting. Silas slipped the card into his field laptop, watching as thumbnails loaded. The first few dozen images were standard landscape photography: sunrise over Bond Cliff, mist in the valleys. But as the timestamps progressed through the last 3 days, the photos became stranger. The same white pine, photographed from slightly different angles. Dozens of shots, maybe more than 100, all of the same tree. The angle changes weren't random. They formed a slow circle around the tree, as if James had been walking around it repeatedly, taking a photo every few steps. Then came the drone footage. The video file was dated 2 days ago, 3:47 p.m. It showed an aerial view of the forest canopy, the drone rising above the trees in clear violation of wilderness regulations. But James hadn't been sightseeing. The drone was following something. A figure moving through the trees below, barely visible through the canopy. The figure wore dark clothing, moved with purpose, and seemed to be following a trail that didn't officially exist. The drone followed for 3 minutes before the video cut abruptly. The next file was from an hour later, shot from ground level. James's face appeared briefly in frame as he set up the camera, and Silas paused the video to study it. The photographer looked haggard, scared. His jacket was torn, and there was a bruise developing on his left cheek. "If someone finds this," James said to the camera, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was following him. The man from Thoreau Falls. I thought he was just another hiker, but he's been out here for weeks, maybe months. He has a camp, but it's not normal." The camera shook as James picked it up. "I found his markers yesterday, little piles of stones, but arranged specifically, like a code. I started photographing them, and that's when I realized they all led to the same place. This tree, this specific tree. He comes here every day at sunset, sits there for exactly 1 hour, then leaves." The video showed James moving through the forest, camera held low. Rain was beginning to fall, heavy drops that would soon turn the trails to mud. Then, abruptly, the camera swung upward, catching a glimpse of someone standing perhaps 30 feet away. The figure was tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like old military surplus gear. His face was obscured by a hood, but his posture was wrong somehow, too rigid. The video ended there. James Whitcomb had been due back at the ranger station yesterday morning. Silas pocketed the memory card and studied the area where he'd found it. The blood trail was minimal, just a few drops on the granite. But there were boot prints, 2 sets, heading deeper into the wilderness toward the area locals called the Silent Zone. The Silent Zone wasn't an official designation. It was ranger slang for a section of the Pemi where sound behaved strangely. Whether due to the specific arrangement of ridges and valleys or some acoustic phenomenon no one had studied, sounds in that area didn't carry the way they should. You could shout and barely hear your own echo. Even the birds seemed quieter there. It was also where James's GPS track ended. His wife had provided his Garmin data. The track showed him entering the Silent Zone 2 days ago at 6:23 p.m. then nothing. The GPS had either been turned off, run out of battery, or been destroyed. Silas radioed his position to base, but the mountains were playing their usual games with communication. His transmission broke up, scattered into static. He got through enough to report finding evidence and continuing the search, but the response was mostly garbled. He followed the boot prints deeper into the wilderness. The trail they followed wasn't on any map, but it was old, worn by years of use. Someone had been coming this way regularly, maintaining this path without official sanction. The wilderness designation meant no trail maintenance was allowed, but someone had been clearing deadfall, marking routes with subtle blazes. 2 hours of hiking brought him to the tree from James's photos. It was massive, probably 300 years old, a white pine that had somehow survived the logging that had cleared most of New Hampshire's forests in the 1800s. Around its base, arranged in concentric circles, were small piles of stones. Not cairns exactly, but something more deliberate. Each pile had exactly 7 stones, arranged in specific patterns. Carved into the bark, old enough that the tree had partly healed around them, were symbols. Not letters or numbers, but something that looked almost like astronomical symbols. Circles, crescents, lines connecting them in patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. A twig snapped behind him. Silas turned to find a man standing 20 feet away, so still he might have been there the whole time. It was the figure from James's video. Tall, gaunt, wearing military surplus from what looked like the Vietnam era. His face was weathered and deeply lined, with eyes that didn't blink often enough. "You're looking for the photographer," the man said. His voice was rusty, like he didn't use it often. "James Whitcomb, is he safe?" The man tilted his head. "Safe is relative out here. He's alive. Whether he stays that way depends on you." "Are you threatening him?" "I'm stating facts. He found something he shouldn't have. Documented things that weren't meant to be documented. The wilderness has rules, Ranger, not your rules. Older rules." "Where is James?" The man pointed deeper into the silence zone. "There's a stone cabin. Unofficial. Built in the 1930s by the CCC, forgotten when the wilderness designation came through. He's there. But you should know, he's not alone." "Who's with him?" "Someone who thinks documentation is theft. Someone who believes photographs steal souls, that mapping sacred places destroys their power. Someone who's been protecting this place for 43 years. The man led him through the forest, weaving between trees with practiced ease. They walked for 20 minutes in increasing rain, then emerged into a clearing where a stone structure sat like something from another century. The cabin was built into a hillside, walls made from local granite. Its roof collapsed and replaced by a makeshift tarp. Smoke rose from a chimney that looked recently repaired. "He's inside," the man said, "along with my colleague." Silas knocked firmly. "This is Ranger Harrington with New Hampshire State Parks. I need to confirm James Whitcomb's safety." The door opened, and James stood there, alive but clearly shaken. His camera was gone. His hands had the slight tremor of someone running on adrenaline and no sleep. "Ranger," he said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank God." Behind James, sitting at a handmade table covered in papers and photographs, was an elderly person, gender ambiguous with age, wearing clothes that looked hand-woven. They looked up at Silas with surprisingly sharp eyes. "Mr. Whitcomb has been our guest," they said, voice carrying an accent Silas couldn't place. "We've been discussing his documentation of sacred sites, explaining why some things shouldn't be photographed, shouldn't be mapped, shouldn't be reduced to content for social media." Silas entered, noting details. 2 cups on the table, both with liquid still steaming. Food remnants suggesting meals shared, not forced. No visible restraints, no weapons in sight. "James, are you here voluntarily?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but they have all my equipment. My camera, my drone, my GPS. They say I can have them back if I agree to delete everything, to never speak about this place." "That's theft," Silas said to the elderly person. "That's negotiation. Mr. Whitcomb violated federal law by flying a drone in designated wilderness. He trespassed on sacred sites, documented ceremonies meant to be private. We could report him, see him prosecuted. Instead, we're offering him education and a clean slate." Silas noticed the papers on the table more clearly now. They were photographs, old ones, decades old. They showed the same tree, the same stone markers, but with different people. A younger version of the elderly person, the military man when his hair was still dark. "What is this place?" Silas asked. The elderly person smiled slightly. "A clock, a calendar, a library written in stone and wood, and the movement of shadows. The Abenaki peoples knew it, used it, protected it. When they were forced out, a few stayed behind, hidden, maintaining the knowledge. I'm the last of that line, and Marcus here," they gestured to the military man, "is my chosen successor." "The tree," James said suddenly. "It's not just a tree. The way the light hits it, the shadows it casts, they mark specific times, specific dates. The stone piles are counters, moved according to patterns. It's like a computer made of forest." The elderly person nodded. "You see why we can't let this become public. The moment it's on Instagram, this place is destroyed. Not physically, legally. It becomes a tourist destination, requires protection, interpretation, all the infrastructure that destroys what makes it work." Silas had a decision to make. By law, James had committed violations. The drone use alone was a federal offense, but these people had also committed crimes: theft, unlawful detention, even if James claimed it was voluntary. He could arrest everyone, let the courts sort it out. Or, "Here's what's going to happen," Silas said. "James, you're going to come with me now. We're going to report you found, safe, temporarily lost due to weather. Your equipment was damaged in a stream crossing. Memory cards destroyed. Unfortunate, but it happens." James started to protest, but Silas continued. "In return, these people remain unofficial, undocumented. The site remains protected by its anonymity." The elderly person stood, retrieved James's backpack from a corner. The camera was there, the drone, the GPS unit. But when James checked, all the memory cards were blank, professionally wiped. "Water damage," the elderly person said. "So unfortunate." As they prepared to leave, the elderly person handed Silas a small stone, smooth and flat, with a symbol carved into it matching one from the tree. "For your silence," they said, "and for your understanding that not all knowledge is meant to be public." The hike out took 4 hours through increasing rain. James was quiet most of the way. Finally, as they neared the trailhead, he spoke. "They're right, aren't they? About keeping it secret. I don't know if they're right, but I know that once something's on the internet, you can't undo it. Some things are more valuable as mysteries than as content." The search team was relieved to see them. Silas gave his report. Hiker lost in unexpected weather, equipment damaged, successful recovery. No mention of the cabin, the guardians, the ancient clock made of forest and stone. Later that night, Silas sat writing his official report. He included everything required: times, coordinates, weather conditions. But nothing about what they'd really found. That knowledge sat separately, like the stone in his pocket, real but undocumented. 3 days later, his supervisor, Captain Emmett Callahan, called him in. The 30-year veteran read Silas's report slowly, then set it down. Clean report, maybe too clean. "Sir?" Whitcomb's wife called. Said her husband has been acting strange. Deleted all his photography files. Sold his drone. Talking about respecting places. Trauma response, maybe. Callahan studied him, then opened his desk drawer, pulled out an identical stone. "Got this in 1994. Similar situation. The forest has been here longer than us, will be here after us. Some things were just temporary custodians of... So you know. I know enough to know I don't want to know more. The Pemi has its guardians. They don't hurt anyone, don't interfere with legitimate recreation. They just protect certain places from becoming Instagram destinations." Over the following months, Silas occasionally encountered signs of the Guardian's presence. A maintained trail that shouldn't exist. Fresh markers appearing when needed during difficult rescues. The forest seemed to watch over those who watched over it. James Whitcomb never returned to the Pemi. He shifted his photography to urban landscapes, subjects that didn't carry the weight of ancient secrets. But he sent Silas a message once. "I dream about that tree sometimes, about the patterns in the shadows. I almost understood it. But maybe understanding would have been worse than not knowing." The following spring, Silas returned to the tree. Marcus was there, sitting against it, reading. "You're trying to understand," Marcus said, without looking up. "Some patterns are meant to be felt, not understood. This place has been keeping time for longer than anyone knows. We're just the latest watchers. What happens when the elderly person is gone? Someone else learns what they can, protects what they must. The knowledge degrades with each generation, but the place remains." Years passed. Silas encountered the Guardians occasionally, found other rangers who carried stones, who understood the unspoken agreement. They never discussed it directly, but they knew each other by the choices they made, the reports they didn't file. The Pemi continued to keep its secrets. The silent zone remained silent, pregnant with meaning that couldn't be spoken. The tree continued marking time in shadows and light. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, in a stone cabin that didn't officially exist, knowledge was being preserved not through documentation but through presence. The call came through at exactly 2:17 a.m., crackling through the static that always plagued the Kankamagas Highway's dead zones like a ghost trying to materialize. Rowan LeBlanc had been parked at the Hancock Overlook, watching for illegal camping activity, when dispatch managed to punch through the interference with 4 words that made her blood run cold. Child missing. Hancock Bridge. She was 7 miles from Hancock Bridge, but at this hour, with the road empty and her urgency absolute, she could make it in 5 minutes. As she drove, dispatch fed her what little information they had through bursts of clear transmission. An SUV, dark blue or black, found abandoned on the shoulder near the bridge. Lights off, engine cold, driver's door open. A child's car seat in the back, straps unbuckled, no child. The Kankamagas Highway was 34 miles of scenic byway cutting through the heart of the White Mountain National Forest. During the day, it was one of New England's most beautiful drives. At night, it was a corridor of darkness so complete that even high beams seemed to be swallowed after 30 feet. No streetlights, no buildings, no cell towers for most of its length. Just road and forest, and the occasional glimpse of stars through the canopy. Rowan knew every mile of it, every pull-off, every trailhead, every place where the unwary or the desperate might disappear into the woods. She'd been patrolling this stretch for 6 years, long enough to know that 2:17 a.m. was the devil's hour on the Kankomagus. That's when the drunks who'd made it this far from North Conway finally crashed. That's when the suicides parked their cars and walked into the forest. That's when things happened that made no sense in daylight but perfect sense in the dark. She found the SUV exactly where dispatch had said, pulled onto the narrow shoulder just past the bridge. Her headlights illuminated the open driver's door, the interior lights still on but dimming as the battery drained. She called in her arrival, then approached carefully, flashlight sweeping the area. The child's car seat was empty, as reported, but it was what she found on the seat beside it that made her stomach clench. A stuffed rabbit, worn from loving, and a sippy cup still half full of apple juice. The juice was still cold. This was recent, maybe within the last hour. She circled the vehicle, looking for signs of struggle, accident, anything that might explain the abandonment. The keys were still in the ignition. A purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside with a New Hampshire driver's license. Sarah Donnelly, 32 years old, from Concord. In the wallet's photo section, a picture of Sarah with a little girl, maybe 3 years old, both smiling at a beach somewhere. No signs of blood, no damage to the vehicle, no skid marks on the road suggesting an emergency stop. It was as if Sarah Donnelly had simply decided to stop here, in the middle of nowhere at 2:17 a.m. and walk away with her child. Rowan expanded her search, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness around the vehicle. That's when she saw them. Tire tracks leading off the road into the small parking area for the Hancock Notch Trail. Fresh tracks, the tread pattern still sharp in the sandy soil. But more interesting was that they split. One set continued to the trail parking area. The other veered off toward an old Forest Service road that had been officially closed for a decade. She followed the second set first, the one heading for the closed road. About 50 yards in, she found where a vehicle had stopped, turned around, and headed back out. But there were footprints here too, adult-sized, leading from where the vehicle had stopped toward a path she knew well. The abandoned fire access road that led to the old CCC fire tower on Hancock Mountain. Back at the highway, she radioed dispatch with an update, but the static was worse now, her transmission breaking up. She caught pieces of their response. Backup was coming, but from where and when was lost in interference. She had to make a decision. Wait for backup that might be 20 minutes away, or follow the tracks now while they were fresh. The temperature was dropping. If a 3-year-old was out here, every minute mattered. She grabbed her emergency pack, made sure her radio was on the emergency channel even if it wasn't working properly, and started up the fire road. The old CCC fire tower had been built in 1935, part of the Civilian Conservation Corps' efforts to provide fire monitoring across the White Mountains. It had been abandoned in the 1970s when aerial surveillance replaced watchtowers, and officially condemned in the 1990s. But Rowan knew it was still standing, still climbed by urban explorers and photographers seeking unique vantage points. It was a 40-minute hike in daylight. In the dark, carrying emergency gear, it might take an hour. 20 minutes up the trail, she found the first sign. She was on the right track. A small pink mitten, child-sized, caught on a branch at exactly the height a 3-year-old's hand would be. She bagged it, marked the GPS coordinates, and kept climbing. The trail was overgrown, branches reaching across like grasping fingers. Her flashlight created a tunnel of light ahead, but peripheral darkness pressed in from all sides. Every sound, wind through leaves, animals moving through underbrush, the creak of old trees, seemed amplified. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the forest. It was rhythmic, metallic, like someone striking metal on metal. Ping, 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 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause. It was coming from ahead, from the direction of the tower. She climbed faster now, her breathing hard in the thin mountain air. The sound continued, never varying in rhythm. As she got closer, she could smell something else. Smoke, but not wood smoke. Something chemical, acrid. The fire tower appeared out of the darkness like a skeletal giant, its metal framework black against the stars. At its base, a small fire burned, but it wasn't logs. Someone was burning flares, road flares, creating a bright chemical light that hurt to look at directly. And there, silhouetted against the false daylight of the burning flares, was a figure. Adult-sized, standing perfectly still, facing the tower. "Sarah Donnelly," Rowan called out, hand on her service weapon but not drawing it. "I'm Ranger LeBlanc with New Hampshire State Parks. Is your daughter with you?" The figure turned slowly. It was Sarah, matching the driver's license photo, but her expression was blank, unfocused. She was holding something, a hammer, Rowan realized, the source of the metallic sound. She'd been striking the metal support of the tower. "She's safe," Sarah said, her voice dreamy, disconnected. "She's up there, safe from them." Rowan's blood went cold. "Up where?" "In the tower." Sarah nodded, then turned back to striking the metal. Ping, ping, ping. The fire tower was 60 feet tall, its stairs rusted, many missing or broken. The platform at the top was partially collapsed, deemed structurally unsound 20 years ago. If a 3-year-old was up there... "Sarah, I need you to put the hammer down and talk to me. Who is them? Who are you keeping your daughter safe from?" Sarah stopped hammering, looked at Rowan with sudden focus. "You don't know? You didn't see the cars? They've been following us since Manchester. 3 cars, taking turns, staying just far enough back. But I know the game. I know what they want." "What do they want, Sarah?" "Her. They want Emma, just like they took the others. You must have the reports, the missing children along this highway. 1 every few years. Always at night. Always near the bridges. But I'm smarter. I got her somewhere they can't reach." Rowan kept her voice calm while her mind raced. There had been missing children cases on the Cank Sarah. "Listen to me," Rowan said, moving slowly closer. "I need to check on Emma. I need to make sure she's okay. Can you tell me exactly where she is?" Sarah's face crumpled. "The platform. I carried her up, told her it was a game, like camping. She has her blanket, her rabbit. She's probably asleep by now. She was so tired." Rowan looked up at the tower, its skeletal frame disappearing into darkness above the ring of flare light. The structure swayed slightly in the wind, metal groaning. Even in its prime, the tower had been a challenging climb. Now, with rust and decay, missing steps and weakened supports, it was a death trap. "Sarah, I'm going to go check on Emma, okay? But I need you to stay here. Keep the fire going so she can see the light. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded eagerly, adding another flare to the fire. "Yes, yes. Keep the light going, so they can't approach in the dark. Light keeps them away." Rowan approached the tower's base, tested the first few steps. The metal was cold, slick with moisture from the night air. Some steps were solid, others shifted under her weight. She could hear the whole structure responding to her presence, vibrations traveling up through the framework. She climbed slowly, testing each step before committing her weight. 20 feet up, a step gave way entirely, the rusted metal crumbling under her boot. She caught herself on the railing, heart pounding, rust flakes raining down on Sarah below. 30 feet up, she could hear something above her. A small voice singing softly. A child's voice, singing a lullaby to herself or maybe to her stuffed rabbit. Emma was alive, awake, Emma? Rowan called up. Emma, my name is Rowan. I'm a park ranger. I'm coming up to help you, okay? The singing stopped. A small face appeared at the edge of the platform above, peering down through a gap in the floor. Where's Mommy? Mommy's right down there, keeping the fire going. She asked me to come check on you. Are you hurt? I'm cold, and the floor moves when I move. Okay, sweetie. I need you to stay very still, okay? Don't move around. I'm almost there. The last 20 feet were the worst. The stairs were more gap than step, the railing barely attached. Rowan had to use the structural beams themselves, climbing like it was a jungle gym, rust coating her hands, her uniform snagging on protruding bolts. Finally, she pulled herself onto the platform. It was maybe 8 feet square, with gaps in the floor where boards had rotted away. In the corner, wrapped in a Disney princess blanket, clutching a stuffed rabbit, was Emma Donnelly. She was smaller than Rowan had expected, maybe not quite 3, with her mother's dark hair and huge, frightened eyes. "Hi, Emma," Rowan said softly, not moving closer yet, not wanting to shift the platform's weight suddenly. "That's a nice rabbit." "His name is Buttons. That's a good name." "Emma, we're going to play a game, okay? I'm going to come over there very slowly, and then I'm going to pick you up, and we're going to go see Mommy." Emma nodded, but then said something that made Rowan's blood chill. "Are the bad cars gone?" "What bad cars, sweetie?" "The ones that followed us." Mommy kept looking in the mirror and crying. She said we had to hide from the bad cars. Rowan processed this. Sarah's paranoia had been real to her, real enough to drive her to this desperate action. But that didn't mean the danger wasn't real, too. Sometimes paranoid people really were being followed. She moved carefully across the platform, each step causing the structure to sway slightly. When she reached Emma, she picked her up gently, the child immediately wrapping her arms around Rowan's neck. "We're going to go down now, but it's like a game. You have to hold on tight and keep your eyes closed. Can you do that?" Emma nodded against her shoulder. "Buttons, too. Buttons, too." The descent was a nightmare. Every movement had to be calculated. One arm holding Emma, the other finding handholds. The child's added weight changed her center of gravity, made every step more precarious. Halfway down, her radio crackled to life. Finally, a clear signal. "LeBlanc, this is dispatch. Backup is on scene at the SUV. What's your 20? She couldn't respond, couldn't risk letting go to key the mic. They'd have to track her GPS, follow her path. Below, she could see Sarah still feeding the fire, still standing guard against imaginary threats. Or maybe not imaginary, because as she descended, she heard something that didn't belong. Engines. Multiple engines coming up the access road. Not the standard Crown Vics of the state police, but something heavier, more powerful. Sarah heard them too. Her whole body went rigid, and she started striking the tower again, faster now, frantic. "They found us. They found us." I knew the fire would bring them. Rowan was still 15 feet off the ground when the vehicles arrived. 3 black SUVs, no official markings, no light bars. They stopped just outside the circle of flare light. Engines running. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then doors opened, and figures stepped out. They weren't in uniform, but they moved like law enforcement or military, controlled, coordinated, purposeful. One of them, apparently the leader, stepped into the light. "Mrs. Donnelly," he called out, "we've been looking for you." Sarah screamed, actually screamed, and ran toward the tower like she was going to climb it. Rowan had to make a decision. She couldn't climb down fast with Emma, but she couldn't stay on the deteriorating tower either. "Stop right there," she called down, her command voice cutting through the chaos. I'm Ranger LeBlanc with New Hampshire State Parks. Identify yourselves immediately." The lead figure looked up, seemed to notice her for the first time. "Ma'am, we're with a private security firm hired by Mrs. Donnelly's husband. She took their daughter in violation of a custody order. We're here to recover the child." Sarah was sobbing now, clinging to the tower's base. "He's not her father. He's not. Check the birth certificate, check the DNA. He's not her father, but the court gave him custody anyway. His money, his lawyers, his connections." Rowan's mind raced. Custody disputes were civil matters, not criminal. Private security firms had no authority to forcibly recover a child, especially not on state land. But 3 SUVs worth of them suggested they didn't care much about jurisdiction. "I need to see documentation," Rowan called down. "Until then, everyone stays where they are." The lead man reached into his jacket, and Rowan tensed, but he pulled out a folded document. "Court order, dated yesterday. Full custody to David Brennan, with authorization for recovery by any legal means." Brennan. Even from this height, even in the bad light, she could see Sarah's reaction to the name. Pure terror. "Please," Sarah called up to her. "Please don't give her to them." "You don't understand what he is, what he does." "The court didn't believe me, said I was hysterical, paranoid, but I know. A mother knows." Rowan made another decision. "I'm bringing the child down," she called. "Everyone stays back until we can verify documentation and identities." She descended the last 15 feet as quickly as she dared. The moment her feet hit the ground, she set Emma down but kept her hand on the child's shoulder. Emma immediately ran to her mother, and Sarah scooped her up, holding her like she'd never let go. The security team started moving closer, spreading out to surround them. Rowan keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is LeBlanc. I need immediate backup at the CCC Tower, Hancock Mountain. Multiple individuals claiming to be private security, attempting to take custody of a minor. Potential child endangerment situation." The response was immediate. Units responding. ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, these men could take the child and be gone. Rowan positioned herself between Sarah and the approaching men. "The child stays with me until law enforcement arrives," she said firmly. The lead man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ranger, you're interfering with a lawful custody order. I'm ensuring the safety of a child in my jurisdiction. You can wait 5 minutes." But Sarah wasn't waiting. She whispered something to Emma, set her down, and then did something that changed everything. She pulled out a cell phone, one that had supposedly been dead, no signal, and hit a single button. "It's live streaming," she said, her voice suddenly steady. "Has been for the last 10 minutes. Thousands of people are watching right now. They see you, they see your vehicles, they see everything. You take her now, the whole world watches you do it." The lead man's face changed, the confident smile disappearing. He pulled out his own phone, spoke quietly into it. The other men stopped advancing, waiting. Rowan heard the sirens before she saw the lights. State police coming fast up the access road. The security team heard them too. Without a word, they retreated to their vehicles, engines starting, backing down the narrow road before the police could block them in. Sarah collapsed, still holding Emma, sobbing with relief. The live stream, Rowan realized, had been a bluff. The phone screen was black, the battery dead. But the bluff had bought them the time they needed. The state police arrived, followed by her backup, followed by Child Protective Services. The investigation that followed would be complex, revealing layers of accusation and counter-accusation, claims of abuse, of mental illness, of corruption in the family court system. David Brennan's security team would claim they'd simply been following a legal custody order. Sarah would claim they were hired thugs, that Brennan had connections that let him operate outside the law. The truth, Rowan learned, was somewhere in between and nowhere simple. Brennan was wealthy, connected, had won custody through expensive lawyers despite troubling allegations. Sarah might have been paranoid, but she also might have been right. The system had failed either a disturbed mother or a protective one, and Rowan would never know for certain which. Emma was placed in temporary foster care while the courts sorted through the mess. Sarah was hospitalized for exhaustion and psychological evaluation. The fire tower, already condemned, was finally demolished. The incident had proven how dangerous it had become. But Rowan couldn't forget what Emma had said on that platform. Mommy kept looking in the mirror and crying. The terror in Sarah's eyes when Brennan's name was mentioned. The way 3 SUVs of private security had materialized in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m., like they'd been tracking Sarah all along. She filed her report, testified when asked, did her duty. But late at night, patrolling the Kankomagus highway, she would think about the moment on the tower. Emma in her arms, Sarah below with her desperate hammer strikes, and those black SUVs emerging from the darkness like predators who'd finally cornered their prey. She would think about systems, legal systems, social systems, the systems meant to protect children, and how they could be twisted by money and influence. She would think about mothers' instincts dismissed as hysteria, about fathers' rights that might not be rights at all, about children caught between. And sometimes, at 2:17 a.m. exactly, she would pass that spot near Hancock Bridge and remember the abandoned SUV, the empty car seat, the cold, sippy cup. She would think about desperation so complete it drove a woman to carry her daughter up a condemned tower in the dark, convinced it was the only way to keep her safe. The highway kept its secrets, as highways do. How many other desperate flights had played out along its dark miles? How many other parents had made impossible choices at impossible hours? The Kankomagus didn't judge. It just stretched through the mountains, beautiful by day, treacherous by night, a corridor between civilizations where sometimes civilization's rules broke down.